Good afternoon. I'm Ron Leibowitz, president of Brandeis University, and my wife Jessica and I are delighted to welcome you to today's panel discussion, 2020 U.S. election results and the future of the Middle East. Today's webinar, led by two of Brandeis's research centers, the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies and the Crown Center for Middle East Studies, discuss the significance and potential impact of the recent U.S. election on the future politics of the Middle East. The mission of these two centers is critical to Brandeis's role in the teaching and research on this strategic and complex region of the world. The Schusterman Center is dedicated to supporting and growing the academic field of Israel studies. It is committed to creating and sharing knowledge about modern state of Israel. Through its research and teaching programs, lectures, conferences, publications, films, and art exhibitions, the center nurtures a worldwide community of people who are interested, curious, and knowledgeable about Israel. The Crown Center for Middle East Studies, led by our moderator, Dr. Gary Seymour, is committed to conducting dispassionate research on the modern Middle East. Its faculty teach undergraduate and graduate level courses across many disciplines here at Brandeis. During its 15 years of operation, scholars with expertise that spans the 22 members of the Arab League, as well as Turkey, Iran, and Israel, have conducted research that includes the politics, economics, history, security, sociology, and anthropology of the region. It seeks strategic collaborations with other leading research centers, such as the one with the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., home to one of our panelists today, Dr. Myra Kaufman-Wittes. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Dr. Gary Seymour, professor of the practice of politics at Brandeis and Crown Family Director of the Crown Center for Middle East Studies. Dr. Seymour served in U.S. government for more than 20 years under Presidents Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, focusing on nuclear arms control and preventing the spread of nuclear weapons, especially in the Middle East and Asia. Outside government, he held senior research and administrative positions at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Belfer Center for Science and International Security at Harvard University. Gary, thank you for moderating what I'm sure will be an engaging and timely discussion.
Thank you very much, Ron and Jessica. Good day to everybody. My name's Gary Seymour, Director of the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis. Thank you all for joining us. Our topic today is the impact of the U.S. presidential elections on the Middle East. And we've assembled a terrific panel of experts from around the world. Eva Bellin, who's professor of politics and chair of the politics department at Brandeis. Dr. Ebtesam Al-Ketbi, the founder and president of the Emirates Policy Center, who's joining us from the UAE. Yehudah Mirsky, professor of Near East and Judaic Studies and on the faculty of the Schusterman Center for Israeli Studies at Brandeis. Michael Singh, Senior Fellow, Managing Director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, joining us from our nation's capital. And Dr. Myra Kaufman-Wittes, who is also in DC, Senior Fellow at the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. We are posting on the chat function a link to the complete bios of our very impressive list of panelists. So let's get started. I'm going to have a discussion with the panel for about 40 minutes, and then we'll turn to questions from the audience, which will be moderated by my colleague, Professor Alex Kay, who's the chair of Israeli Studies at Brandeis. So please enter your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and Alex will then organize them and we'll ask them of the panelists, and we'll end promptly at 1 p.m. So Eva, let me start with you. I think it's fair to say that around the world, most US allies and partners were relieved by the election of Joe Biden, whose promise to restore American commitment to multilateralism and repair damage to US alliances around the world. But not so much in the Middle East, where some leaders are concerned that Biden may revert to policies of the Obama administration that they didn't like, and among leaders in the Middle East who've enjoyed a close personal relationship with President Trump. And President Erdogan of Turkey is one such leader. In some respects, his personal relationship with Trump has protected Turkey from some of the disagreements that the US and Turkey have had in recent years over foreign policy. So how do you see US-Turkish relations faring under a Biden administration? Will there be improvement or deterioration?
Well, thank you, Gary. I was giving some thought to Erdogan's role in the international stage and really looking at how he's behaved over the past 10 years. You can really just say that he has embraced the role of deliberate provocateur. Whereas when he began as the prime minister of Turkey 2003, and he embraced a zero problem with the neighbors policy, he focused primarily on building alliances and being a good NATO ally and trying to get Turkey positioned to join the EU. About 10 years ago, we saw a pivot in his policies. And since then, he has seemed to be taking every opportunity to stir up trouble, to project regional strength, and to try to expand Turkey's influence over its former imperial subjects. And the goal has always been to assert Turkey's independence and to restore Turkey's grandeur as a global force to be reckoned with, this whole neo-Ottoman kind of project. And we have seen him be extremely provocative in essentially 5 areas. We have seen it in Turkey's purchase of the S-400 missile system from Russia, which was designed originally to shoot down NATO jets. We see it in Turkey's intervention in the South Caucasus, where Erdogan has sent arms and drones and mercenaries to fight alongside the Azerbaijanis in that conflict, and he has encouraged military aggressiveness there. We see it in Turkey's intervention in the Libyan civil war with provision of mercenaries and maybe might even act as a spoiler in those peace talks. We see it in Turkey's military interventions in northern Syria and in border areas in Iraqi Kurdistan, where he has intensified the battle against the PKK. And we see it in Turkey's dispatch of warships in the Eastern Mediterranean in the hunt for oil and gas and waters that Greece and Cyprus claim. So what's going on here? What we see is just consistent provocation. And Erdogan is clearly playing to his base. He's aiming to project Turkish power and independence in the international sphere. And that way he can create a distraction from his country's increasingly tanking economy. So the question is the Biden administration going to take the bait and go after him? As you said, Gary, under Trump, there was some reluctance by the administration to go after him because Trump seemed to have some special relationship with Erdogan. I have to say, I don't entirely understand that. People have made allusions to maybe business deals he had with Erdogan. Other people say, well, there's an affinity between 2 strong populist strongmen. I don't quite understand it, but there is a sense that, with Trump gone, Erdogan is going to not be able to get away with as much and might expect harsher treatment from the Biden administration. And I think we can certainly expect more rhetorical whipping by Biden of the Biden administration of Erdogan. Biden has already called out Erdogan for being an autocrat. I think that was more than a year ago, even though the Turkish press was furious about that. But what we have here is a case of a provocateur versus a pragmatist. And, I'm not really sure that Biden is going to be drawn into battle with this provocateur, nor should he. I mean, Turkey, I don't really think is on the administration's radar screen. I would say in general, the Middle East is not really on Biden's radar screen. It's not a big issue for the administration right now. The new administration, I think he is concerned about terrorism. He's concerned about showing loyalty to Israel. He is concerned about Iran and reopening negotiations. But other than that, I think he really wants to stay out of the Middle East. Wants to end the forever wars, wants to get the troops back home. And so his priorities are not about engaging with Erdogan and taking on Turkish adventurism. So I think aside from just some rhetorical browbeating of Turkey, I don't expect to see major shifts in the administration's policies toward Turkey in the near future.
Thank you, Eva. So Dr. Ebtesam, let me continue with the same theme. The UAE and Saudi Arabia have enjoyed good relations with President Trump, both on the personal level and support for his tougher position toward Iran and his help with the Abraham Accords, an important achievement. During the campaign, President-elect Biden had very harsh words for Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and has vowed to end US support for Saudi involvement in the war in Yemen. So the question I have is how you see US relations with the Arab Gulf states, and in particular with Saudi Arabia. How is that going to proceed under a Biden administration, and what steps do you think can be taken to reduce tensions between Riyadh and Washington? I think you're muted, Dr. Ebtesam, you're muted.
Yeah. Gary, thank you for this invitation and to be with those wonderful and good friend of the speakers. Well, I will talk here from Gulf perspective and mainly UAE perspective. First, on the issue of the Arab Gulf countries and Biden administration, if US President Joe Biden administration relationship with Arab Gulf countries tends to be more harmonious, consistent, balanced, and institutionalized, this will be good for these countries. The relation between US and Arab Gulf countries is not limited, of course, to the character of personnel relationship and diplomacy that has been developed by President Trump over the past 4 years. It is rather strategic and geosecurity relationship that surpasses the partisan issues in American politics. This relationship has always been resilient, that absorbs differences between the successive American administration without mainly affecting the common strategic interests of both sides. Arab Gulf countries have enough resilience to grasp and understand the priorities of American allies and explain their concern to Washington. Now, the Emirati-American relationship will always be strong. Abu Dhabi will have a good working relationship with President Biden because it appreciates the qualitative strategic value of the alliance and friendship with Washington. UAE will continue its active participation in burden sharing, support for what enhanced security, stability, and economic recovery in the region. Abu Dhabi will always support diplomatic solution to crisis in Yemen, Libya, Syria, the war against terrorism, and support for empowering values of tolerance, coexistence, and dialogue among Abrahamic faith and various cultures. Now, UAE thinks that not only it is in the US interest to have more strong, stable security partners, but if US really does want to do less than the region, you are going to have Euro friends do more. And in order for Euro friends to do more, we have to enhance their capacities. This, of course, includes Israel along with Arab Gulf countries and their allies, such as Jordan, Morocco, Egypt, Sudan. I cannot claim that I will speak on behalf of Saudi. But I'm giving my perspective, my understanding to the situation of Saudi regarding Yemen. United States, yes, is calling for a rapid diplomatic solution to end the war in Yemen. In fact, also Saudi Arabia wants the same thing to happen as soon as possible. However, in my view, Riyadh wants this to take place, but under certain conditions. Notably, first, Saudi Arabia needs an international guarantee of the peaceful solution to the conflict in Yemen to end catastrophes, war there. Second, Saudi Arabia looks for a safe exit strategy in Yemen. So Iran-backed militia, Houthi, can no longer pose a threat to Saudi national security. Third, Saudi Arabia does not want the humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen, nor the gruesome fate of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi be envisaged as ground for the bias of the West in this conflict, particularly the European. Instead, they should push for a balanced settlement in this war-torn country that can end the catastrophe there based on the formula, no victor, no vanquished. This deal should ensure a strong stability and address security concern of both Saudi Arabia and Oman. Here I'm talking about the Omani long border with Yemen province, Myra. So Biden administration may pursue a more interventionist policy with aim of ending the conflict between Qatar and mainly Saudi Arabia and UAE. But also Saudi Arabia wants Biden administration and also UAE to understand why they took that position towards Qatar. The relation between the Qataris, the Turks, with the non-state actors, which threaten the nation state in the Gulf and the Arab world, their relation with Iran, this is that this administration should take in its consideration. You are on mute, Gary.
I'd like to ask a follow-up question about Iraq. It's a country that Joe Biden knows very well, and Iraqi leaders know Biden very well, I think with some mixed feelings because of his past positions on the invasion of Iraq and the proposal to separate the country into different autonomous sectarian and ethnic parts, and his involvement in Iraqi politics after the election that took place during the Obama administration. So, and we just heard yesterday that President Trump is going to be withdrawing some US forces from Iraq. So what would you like to see from an Emirati perspective? What would you like to see the Biden administration's policies toward Iraq to be?
Well, Gary, UAE calls for offering all possible support to Mustafa Al-Kadhimi, led Iraqi government that is trying to take a serious and significant step to enhance Iraqi national institution and agencies and weaken the influence of pro-Iranian militias in the country. Any step that can contribute to the restoration and consolidation of national and non-sectarian institutions in the country is in the best interest of Iraq itself. GCC countries, the Iraqi neighborhood, and the region as whole, and American interests. This will also help Baghdad counter Tehran's influence in Iran and prevent using the country as a bargaining chip in any future negotiation between Iran and US. For this reason, I call on the US to take into consideration that the continued battle against terrorist group in both Iraq and Syria serve the US interests. It is very critical to sustain the US political and diplomatic involvement in Iraq with the aim of supporting Iraq's state's institution and creating an international environment that can effectively deter Iran-backed militia group that try to intimidate Arab and global actors that wish to invest in the country and contribute to its reconstruction. Whenever you ask the Iranian participant in any conference, Gary, would you like to see a strong Iraq? They answer you no. We don't want strong Iraq. That means Iran wants a weak Iraq that can manipulate its proxies and militias there and keep it always depending on Iran. Improving situation in Iraq will help improve situation in Syria and in Jordan and Lebanon, as well as push for more effective EU involvement in efforts to stabilize the Middle East region. Another thing, the last thing I would say, Gary, please, I am calling from here that stop looking to the region from your frame model, your Western. It doesn't fit in the Middle East. The culture is different. The social context is different. Everything is different. There is no model for democracy. You can frame it, and everybody can fit to that. Even in the Arab world, each country is different than even in GCC countries. Each one is different than other.
Thank you, Ebtesam. So let's turn to Israel, Yehudah. It's no secret that Prime Minister Netanyahu would have preferred President Trump to be reelected. Of course, President Trump has moved the US Embassy to Jerusalem. He's advanced a very friendly peace proposal from Israel's standpoint, and he supported the Abraham Accords. But of course, Biden and Netanyahu know each other for years, which may be a good or bad thing. But I want your views on what the implications will be for US-Israeli relations under a Biden administration. And as a follow-up question, what are the implications for Prime Minister Netanyahu's domestic political position? He's obviously benefited from his good relationship with Trump. Will his position be damaged if he's not seen as having a good personal relationship with the new president?
Great. Well, first, once again, thank you, Gary, and thank you, Ron and Jessica, for bringing us all together. And it's just so great to see my colleagues, because we're so separated these days from going to COVID at all. And speaking of COVID, all politics is local. And of course, in Israel, the uppermost question, as it is in most other places, is coronavirus and the ongoing crisis of Israel's profoundly dysfunctional government and the structural and functional dysfunctionalities of the Israeli government predated Corona, but they're not making it any easier. In many ways, I don't think this is going to I don't think Mr. Biden's election will immediately change anything in Israeli politics, and not only because of Joe Biden's long and frankly terrifying to-do list. Mr. Biden's ability to split somehow, to drive a wedge in the Israeli electorate between left and right, is going to be very limited by the fact that the Israeli left scarcely exists anymore as a viable political force, right? What remains of the Labor Party may never even make it into the Knesset in the next elections. If we look at the things you rightly mentioned, the things that Mr. Trump did and supported here, they were very popular. Some of them were very consensual, like overwhelming majorities of Israeli support moving the embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, the Abraham Accords. These are things that are hard not to like. When we look at issues that there's a little less where the consensus is a little less massive, namely how to deal with Israel's ongoing unresolved conflict with the Palestinians. Some Israelis raised eyebrows and more at Trump's aggressive stances, and some of them were too aggressive even for Netanyahu. One thing interesting to see, because Netanyahu thought that Trump's wholesale denial of any American aid to the Palestinian Authority, even like of any sort, was overdone. But even there, most Israelis see little prospect of meaningful negotiation with a chronically weak and corrupt Palestinian Authority. Now, what's interesting is that Trump, sort of has been a shared enemy for the Palestinian Hamas, that's sort of been bringing them together. Now that they're gone, and there's some more, it's highly unlikely that the Biden administration is going to try to promote a peace process in an aggressive kind of way. But presumably it will relax funding restrictions. Palestinians will have a more receptive ear in the administration. They'll be funding all kinds of peace building, et cetera, activities. The Trump peace plan still seems dead to the world for the future. And of course, the key question is Iran. Iran is the serious existential question that's not going away. Mr. Biden will likely rejoin the deal with Iran. And this will enable both Netanyahu and his coalition partner and chief rival, Benny Gantz, each to argue that they are best suited to handle this new reality, right? Netanyahu has set things up such that no matter what happens, he's the indispensable man. Only I had this great relationship with Donald Trump. Only I know how to handle Joe Biden. On the other hand, Gantz's strengths as a former IDF chief of staff and somebody who did not antagonize the Democratic Party may come into play. Will Gantz and Netanyahu be able to work together on Iran? Will they be able to bury the hatchet, at least to some degree, if it comes to this new American stance? That remains to be seen. Gantz has shown himself at times very willing to do the less rewarding thing for the sake of the greater good. Netanyahu is fighting for his political life now, and he loathes the coalition that he's in. And clearly, any shift in American, the likely shifts in American policy on Iran will strengthen his hand, saying only I can handle this situation. But again, with Gantz there, it makes for a more complicated, he's not an easily dismissible rival. I think two important points to make here. There's not something we have to be honest about, I think, Gary. One reason for Trump's popularity in Israel is the perception that his predecessor, Barack Obama, made a lot of missteps in the region. I think even the fact Israelis were less, I think simply you think that that Obama's deal with Iran was the best thing that America could achieve under the circumstances. But I think that President Obama's mishandling of Syria, the ways in which even people like me were very supportive of the peace process, two-state solution, thought that the way he went about that process had a lot of problems. That in turn made Israelis even more suspicious and critical of his deal with Iran. And Mr. Biden's association with Obama is something that will be hanging in the background there. And one thing that I think a lot of Americans wonder, don't Israelis see all the things about America, about Donald Trump, that drive Americans crazy? I mean, it's fascinating when you talk to Israelis, even reasonably well-informed ones, they're not too bent out of shape over it. And they have a hard time understanding what the fuss is all about. I think in many respects, they think that the positives outweigh the negatives. I think they don't pay a whole lot of attention. Something when people ask me, how do Israelis support Donald Trump so much? I ask if they're Americans. I ask how much time a day do you spend thinking about Justin Trudeau? You know that he basically likes you, and that's kind of all you need to know about him. And they don't obsessively follow Mr. Trump's domestic follies like so many of us do. And frankly, and this is very sad, Mr. Trump's relentless attacks on all kinds of institutions, on law, on the press, on academia, on minorities, are all very good because frankly, Mr. Netanyahu has been doing the same thing for a long time. So, and either they support it or they just say, well, it's just how he talks, because that's how Netanyahu talks all the time. Of course, Netanyahu is far more capable than Trump and has never, denounced the very idea of science or the very idea of expertise. So I think that, I don't think that Mr. Biden's election presages major change in Israeli politics. It becomes one more factor in this evolving situation, shapes some dynamics one way.
Thank you, Yehudah. So Mike, let's turn to Iran. It's the one policy area where there's the clearest difference between Trump and Biden. And I would say Iran may be the one government in the region that most welcomed Biden's victory. Although, of course, the Supreme Leader says that all American leaders are bad. But Biden has said that he's willing to return to the nuclear agreement and lift sanctions if Iran restores its compliance and agrees to negotiate a new agreement. The Iranians have said they won't negotiate a new agreement, and they're demanding compensation for returning to the nuclear deal because of the economic damage they suffered under President Trump. So what do you see as Biden's options in terms of trying to restore some kind of nuclear agreement with Iran?
Thanks a lot, Gary, for having me, and to your whole team at Brandeis. And it's lovely to see so many friends in the attendee list as well. So hello to all of you. I think that the Iranians are probably ambivalent, actually, about President Trump leaving office, because it's true that, he's imposed crushing economic pressure on them. On the other hand, I think that he has also been for them a sort of convenient sort of boogeyman for them, as they've engaged in domestic repression and things like that. It's probably useful for them to have President Trump in office to blame for the regime's ills. But putting that aside, I think the challenge for Biden, for President-elect Biden coming in, is that he really has two key sort of parties with which he has to negotiate, and whose support is critical for the success of any nuclear deal or nuclear policy. And that's Iran, of course, on the one hand. You can't have a nuclear deal without the Iranians. But the second is the Republican Party, because you can't sustain a nuclear deal, President Trump has demonstrated, without some kind of broad or at least sufficient consensus in the United States. And if you look at those two parties, Iran and Republicans, there isn't a lot of overlap between what they're likely to accept. And so I think for Biden, the how of his policy is probably just as important as the what, and the two probably interact. We always tend to talk about, what will Biden do on Iran? What will his policy be? But I think how he's able to manage this tension actually may in part determine the what of his policy, if that makes any sense. Biden has said very clearly that he's going to come in and offer what he calls compliance for compliance. In other words, the U.S. returns to the nuclear deal, Iran returns to the nuclear deal, because Iran, too, has violated the deal in a sort of stepwise fashion over the last couple of years. And the question is, will the Iranians say yes? On the one hand, I would say Iran has been actually quite careful in its own way to preserve the ability to go back to the nuclear deal. It's not left the deal. It's mainly taken steps that are reversible, although not entirely so. And it looks from the outside like this is a policy meant to kind of give them room to go back if they wanted to. On the other hand, though, Iran may perceive this as a moment of leverage, because they know that President Biden, when he comes into office, and the Democratic Party would like to go back to the JCPOA. And if they're going to ask the United States for anything, this is probably the moment to do it for them. And so they'll ask for compensation, perhaps. They've mentioned $250 billion as the amount they feel they're owed. I'm not sure how they calculated that. They may ask for changes to the deal itself, pledges not to use the snapback mechanism again, acknowledgement of the progress they've made on centrifuge R&D, and I won't further define that to avoid getting technical and to avoid Gary correcting me. But they may ask for changes, and that may also reflect the political moment in Iran, because they have presidential elections in June 2021. And President Rouhani may feel as though he needs to play a bit tough with President Biden for his own political sake. Now, in a sense, Iran saying no to compliance for compliance, if that's in fact what happens, might be a gift to Joe Biden. Because the problem he'll have if the Iranians say yes is that every Republican will oppose a return to the JCPOA. So will Israel. So probably will many of our regional partners. That's an easy decision for them. Even some Democrats might be uncomfortable with it, frankly. Whereas once you start talking about something that isn't the JCPOA, whether it's less, frankly, whether it's some kind of, JCPOA minus, like the JPOA for those who followed this closely, or something that's more, a JCPOA plus, then I think you start opening up the possibility of gathering more support. But I think the challenge there, and the thing that the Biden team will worry about, is can you really negotiate anything else, especially with Iranian elections and with Iran feeling as though they got burned the first time around. Look, if you're looking for reasons for optimism, and I know anyone who follows the Middle East is always looking for the thinnest of reeds to cling to, as it were, I think we can say that Republicans and the Biden team, and maybe even Iran, all agree that, in fact, the JCPOA is not sufficient. What's interesting is if you read between the lines, what the Biden team and what Joe Biden himself has said is that, yes, we want to go back to the JCPOA and then negotiate a stronger, more extended agreement. That's not so different from what Republicans have been saying. And it is an acknowledgement, at least tacitly, that the original JCPOA maybe just didn't quite get the job done. And I think the Iranians, too, have their sort of moments of disillusionment with the JCPOA, although maybe in a different direction, frankly. The other reason for optimism is that I think Biden does want to sort of reprioritize Asia, and so does the GOP, so do Republicans. And so at least there's kind of that sense of a shared strategic framework that they're operating from. And so the challenge will be, how do you come up with an approach to Iran that doesn't neglect the issue and doesn't neglect the wider Middle East, but also doesn't put a disproportionate emphasis on this issue or on the Middle East as a region if you're looking to shift to great power competition. And I know Tamara has written a lot about that subject very cogently. And of course, there's no silver bullets for doing that. Maximum pressure has not proven to be a silver bullet. The JCPOA didn't prove to be a silver bullet. And so you're going to be looking to sort of manage this problem going forward, like, frankly, most foreign policy problems. And of course, just as a final note, President Trump is not done. He has 60 more days. And anyone who read the New York Times this morning will see that a lot could happen in 60 days. I'm personally skeptical that we'll see a U.S.-Iran war in the next 2 months, but we'll certainly see more sanctions. And those sanctions will be put on in part in an effort to shape President Biden's options with respect to Iran. Whether that'll succeed or fail is another question. But I don't think we can ignore the fact that the Trump administration is not done on this issue.
Thank you, Mike. Like most things in the Middle East, it's very complicated and difficult. So Tamara, let's talk about the broader context. So far, we've spoken about U.S. relations with different countries, but I want to ask you about the Middle East in the broader scheme of Biden's foreign policy, his emphasis on improving relations with allies, his vow to restore American commitment to values, human rights, and democracy. And how does that fit in with his efforts to reset relations with key countries in the region?
Well, Gary, thanks. And it's great to be with the Crown Center and the Schusterman Center and with my good friends. And I really want to commend you for bringing in these voices, fantastic voices from the region, because it is, in a way, the beginning of the unofficial dialogue. And hopefully that will build to a strong official dialogue in the months to come. Look, one of the strengths that President-elect Biden brings is long experience in foreign affairs, including longtime chairmanship of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, and relationships all over the world. And as you expressed in the introduction, perhaps a sense of relief from a number of America's international partners that they will have now some chance to recover from the incoherence and capriciousness of the Trump administration's approach to the world. So President Biden can hit the ground running, but I think that the challenge he faces is that in the Middle East, perhaps in more than any other region of the world, the ground has shifted since he was last in office. Of course, the region was undergoing profound transformation during the Obama-Biden administration, but it has seen even more in the years since. We've talked about the Turkish role, the shift in Erdogan's involvement in the region, the intervention in Turkey and Libya, and this intense power competition that has emerged between Turkey and other regional powers, all of whom are traditional partners of the United States, which makes it awkward for us. We've seen the involvement of regional powers and outside powers in the wars in this region, and those wars have all grown worse as a result. We've seen new developments, the end of this military-backed Islamist government in Sudan, changes ongoing in Algeria, now a very concerning situation in Ethiopia in which a number of regional parties are involved. The Abraham Accords, of course, which I think presents a kind of transformative potential for cooperation amongst America's partners in the region, and then the impact of COVID and low oil prices, which are having devastating impacts on key American partners like Jordan, for example. So Ebtesam said that she hopes for more consistent, more institutionalized relationships. And I think, frankly, it would be hard to expect they'd be less consistent or less institutionalized. But listening to my friends from Jerusalem and Dubai, and also listening to what we're hearing from European governments and from the Japanese leadership, I'm almost a little bit concerned that America's traditional partners are taking for granted that they know what they're going to get from Joe Biden. And that this partnership is just there waiting to be resumed in good faith. And I think that I think that there are changes on both sides, right? As was very evident in our political campaign, the domestic political context here has changed radically. The ability for us to construct and sustain long-term foreign policy strategies that Democrats and Republicans both support, that's really constrained right now. Michael helpfully, I think, outlined some things on which Democrats and Republicans should agree. But I don't know if that means they will, when it comes to it, put the long-term strategic gain over the short-term political gain. And so that's one concern. I also think that, there are partnerships in this region that we do need to recalibrate. And that's, as Ebtesam said, because if the United States wants to do less in the Middle East so that it can focus resources in other areas, it needs its partners to do more. Part of what we've seen, not just over the course of the Trump years, but even I think before, was our regional partners understanding America's desire to focus more energy elsewhere, taking initiatives of their own to try and shape their environment. Some of those initiatives were destabilizing instead of stabilizing. Some of those initiatives involved targeting common threats like Iran. Some of them involved smaller or more parochial arguments, like I would say within the GCC. And so the challenge for the Biden administration, I think, is to have new conversations with each of its traditional partners in the region that are honest, straightforward, that specify not just common interests, which absolutely we share. And the United States still has very important interests in the Middle East. But it requires also an understanding of common approaches to those challenges and common priorities. So just to take the Iran example, you know, for the world at large, and for some of our regional partners, the nuclear program is the priority. And President Obama decided to make that the priority and said, let's, you know, this is urgent. Let's deal with nuclear proliferation. It's a global security problem. I can get Russia and China on board, and then we'll deal with the other problems that Iran presents. But for our friends in the Gulf, the nuclear issue was always less important than some of the other dimensions of Iranian behavior, the subversion, the role in Iraq, the proxies. And so that Obama approach never really got full buy-in, I think, from the Gulf states. You know, if we're going to go forward with a new effort on Iran, how can the United States come to common terms between Israel, the Gulf states, the European powers, Russia, and China on the priorities with Iran? That to me is a tremendous challenge. But I think that I think the Biden administration is one that will be built on the man. The man is straightforward. He believes in relationships, and he believes in honest conversations. And I think that that's how he's going to begin with Middle Eastern partners and with other partners around the world. So I hope that that will create a basis for cooperation.
Thank you very much, Tamara. Thanks to all of the panelists for really succinct and clear and very insightful comments. So we have some time left for questions. And Alex, I'll turn things over to you.
Thanks very much, Gary, and to all of the panelists. Thank you for the discussion so far. And we have exactly 10 minutes for questions. And so I'm going to ask really the impossible, which is I'm going to ask a series of huge questions. And if you could try and answer them as relatively briefly so we can fit, I'm hoping, at least 3 of these broader questions in. The first question, I'm going to direct this to Mike and Eva. All of you have expertise in this area, but just for the sake of sort of targeting a couple of you. The first question regards the Abraham Accords and what may happen to them as and when or if a new American administration starts to make overtures towards Iran. What will happen to those accords? What will happen to the promise of American military technology to the UAE? Are those two things compatible with each other? Maybe Mike can go first and then Eva.
Thanks, Alex. I think the Abraham Accords will persist. You know, I see sort of multiple underlying trends and a couple proximate causes that brought these accords about. In terms of the proximate causes, I think that, you know, Prime Minister Netanyahu needed a bit of a ladder to climb down on annexation. And I do think that our Gulf allies were looking for ways to maybe improve their image and sort of increase their success in Washington, especially with the prospect of a political change coming in Washington. But I think the underlying trends are actually more important. And that's this development over the years of a shared threat picture between Israel and the Gulf states, and frankly, many other states in the region. I think that the frankly kind of declining importance or declining salience of the Palestinian national issue in the region, and the shift in the region's center of gravity, I should say the Arab world center of gravity, away from its traditional center in Egypt and Syria and towards the Gulf and some of the kind of global aspirations even that those Gulf states have was another trend that played a role here. And then, very frankly, the sort of perception of strategic disengagement by the United States, which Tamara was just touching on, I think also has forced these kind of previously loose or sort of silent coalitions to become a little bit more cohesive and formal. And it's not just this particular coalition between, you know, these sort of more conservative pro-US countries like Israel, UAE, Bahrain, and so forth. But you also see this coalition between Turkey and Qatar, I think, to some extent, a little bit more loosely maybe. And you see a coalition, obviously, between Iran, Syria, and some sort of state-like proxies in the region. So I do think they'll persist. I think that, frankly, the Biden administration, if it's reaching out to Iran, will actually want even more to pay attention to U.S. allies, because that is one frequent critique. People can decide whether it's deserved or not of the Obama administration, is as it was reaching out to Iran, it gave short shrift to our allies. So with the Biden team, with that in mind, I think we'll want to ensure that they keep allies on board.
Yeah, I completely agree with Michael's analysis. And I just say that, shared interests are the basis of these accords. Though I don't see any change in balance of power that's going to change those interests. But I would also say those shared interests also expose the limits of the accord and why it probably will not go beyond where it is right now. Just leave it there.
Okay, thank you both. So let me turn now to, from a sort of broader regional issue to, in some ways, a more local issue. And this is a question for Dr. Ebtesam and Yehudah that a couple of people have asked over the chat and in questions that came in beforehand, which is that some people have criticized the celebration or the celebratory aspects of the closening ties between Israel and the UAE and other Gulf states as a way of sort of obscuring the issue of the Palestinians. And I'd be interested to hear from each of you what you think is the feeling among Israelis and Emiratis, and your own opinions personally about how the Palestinians may fit into this picture. Yes, I should. Yehudah, why don't you take it first, and then Dr. Ebtesam. You're muted.
Right, but not for long. Okay, great. The Palestinian question. Well, obviously, right, that sort of this, I mean, a key feature of these so-called Abraham Accords has been a declaration pretty much by the countries that that have entered into them with Israel, that have normalized relations with Israel, that the Palestinian issue matters much less to them than it has up to now, certainly at the rhetorical level and perhaps practically as well, that they have bigger fish to fry in terms of their concerns about Iran, and they're seeing Israel as a potential ally for all kinds of things, and so the Palestinians matter less to them. For Netanyahu, as Michael Singh put it very well, it got him off the hook of annexation, because also something that's insufficiently appreciated is that the Israeli heart right is as suspicious of Netanyahu and his intentions as anyone. Netanyahu, as some of you have heard me say before, Netanyahu is a master of balancing tactical audacity and strategic caution. So he's never going to do any grand moves, including annexation, and something like this is the kind of incremental move that's sort of a tactically audacious thing that helps him move along. And for many Israelis, again, Iran is the frightening large question, not only Iran's nuclear program, but remember Iran's long hand in terms of its proxies in the form of Hezbollah in Lebanon. Now, at the same time, of course, Israel's unresolved conflict with the Palestinians is a different kind of existential question. Sort of the Palestinians are sort of boxed in a security way. But Israel's unresolved conflict with the Palestinians profoundly affects, and I would say eats away at Israel's fundamental character. And it's, it could conceivably, Netanyahu is betting on the Palestinian issue going unresolved for the foreseeable future. What concerns somebody like me is what that does to Israel over the long term, as well as what it does to the Palestinians. And at the same time, as I said before, the ongoing dysfunction of Palestinian politics, certainly at the senior levels, not necessarily at the working levels, but at the senior levels, regularly validates every, even sort of more centrist Israelis' concerns about doing something forward, and people don't really see a way of moving forward. And it could be that if there is a way of moving forward on the Palestinian issue, as frustrating as it would be with finally doing something that the Oslo Accords promised to do and didn't, and that's sort of somehow actively creating a viable Palestinian political culture in the future. That's not a very satisfying answer for now, but it's probably the best one can do and the best that Israeli traffic can bear. And the last thing I'll say is that there might be, I mean, the problem with the Trump peace plan was that for the Israelis, it was a peace plan, and for the Palestinians, it was terms of surrender. Now, some might argue that it's precisely the Palestinians being at their weakest point that might enable them to finally come to terms with Israel in a way that Israel can accept. But on the other hand, we're talking about a struggle that's very much about national identity and humiliating people. It doesn't necessarily seem to be the way to solve that. Perhaps to the extent to which all these recent developments make Israelis feel a little more secure, then there might be more room maybe for doing things that give Palestinians meaningful political horizon, but frankly, it's going to be a tough sell.
Dr. Ebtesam, where do you think Emirates stand on the Palestinian issue?
Well, I think the Emirati since long time been supported the Palestinian either through aid, through humanitarian aid, the Palestinian right for their state. But UAE thought now 70 years of boycotting Israel, not normalizing relation with Israel. Did it bring anything for the Palestinian or for the Arab? It did not bring anything. So let us think out of the box and look at it from different angle. Would the normalization with Israel, and here I'm talking about warm peace, not cold peace like the Jordanian and the Egyptian one. Would this make Israel see the other side of the coin, that normalization with the Arab, with the Palestinian themselves, that might creating an arc of stability and peace, the Abrahamic Fund, that can encourage the Israeli. In fact, it did make Netanyahu to freeze the annexation. On the other side, this is the settlements. Now, this is another issue. It's not only about UAE and Israel. It's also about the Palestinian, okay? I think they always losing their opportunities, because by condemning, okay, what do you have? What is your plan? Come and discuss it. Come, let us negotiate on the table. They lost their strategic opportunity. Now, if we are going to talk about two-state solution, we are in 2020, the year of crisis. We are not on 1967. So the facts on the ground is different. Can we achieve the two-state solution that came in the initiative of 2000 of the Saudi initiative? Is it applicable? So everybody has to revisit his idea, his model. Okay, bring something. Been talking with yesterday with a group of Israeli and Arabs, and we were discussing this issue and how can we bring the two-state solution on the top priority or one of priority in Biden's agenda. And I was thinking that if we are going to the same rhetoric or the same model, of course, nobody is going to pay any attention. Also, so it takes two to dance tango, right? So it's not only about UAE or Israel, it's also about the Palestinian. Let them think out of the box. This leadership, I don't think it will bring anything new for the Palestinian. The Palestinian need a new generation of leadership, okay? New thinking, new model.
Dr. Ebtesam, thank you so much. And we've come to the end of our hour, so Professor Leibowitz will see us out.
Thank you, Alex. And first of all, thank you, Gary. Thank you, Alex, for hosting this. And also to all the panelists who I think have given us a lot more to think about, both on the local level in the Middle East and also on the grand issues that poses all these challenges to the new Biden administration, to the US, and to the entire world in many ways, very strategic reasons. So thank you. Thank you all. Look forward to future panels hosted by Schusterman and by Crown. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.